It was early evening on a tidy suburban lane where the sidewalks were clean, mailboxes lined up like small sentinels, and maple trees filtered the last of the sun into long, cool shadows. Houses were close enough that porch lights were beginning to flicker on, and a few neighbors were already settling in for dinner, but the street had a hush that felt more private than public. The kind of quiet that made any sudden noise seem louder than it should be. Jamal Carter, who had lived on Willow Bend for 3 years, was walking home from the hardware store with a small box of nails tucked under his arm and his keys in the other hand, thinking about the shelf he would repair that night and the simple pleasure of a well-done job. He was a tall man in his 30s, with careful hands and a patient way of speaking. The neighbors knew him by sight. He mowed an elderly neighbor's lawn. He watched out for stray cats. He brought a tray to community potlucks. Yet in moments like this, those quiet facts would not protect him from someone else's impatience. A patrol car rolled down the street slowly, its engine a subdued purr, and Jamal glanced up to see Officer Stephen Hale, white, square-jawed, in a department uniform that fit like armor, pull to a deliberate stop and step out. Hale's presence was more than official. It had an air of possession, as though his badge let him decide who belonged where. He called out, voice carrying on the still evening, "You there, stop." Jamal stopped, a polite nod forming on his lips. He raised a hand to say hello and ask if everything was okay. But the greeting died in his throat when Hale stepped closer, eyes hard and unreadable. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Hale demanded, circling Jamal with a tone that made casual questions sound like accusations. Jamal answered calmly. He'd been to the hardware store 2 blocks up. He was walking home. He offered his name when asked. That should have been enough. Instead, the officer's mouth twisted. "This neighborhood doesn't need people like you wandering around," he said. The words intentional, each one a shove, and Jamal felt the air change. It was not said quietly. It was meant to be heard by the houses on either side, by anyone who looked out their curtains. There was a threat tucked behind the phrase, an assertion that Jamal's presence was a problem, not an inconvenience. For a moment, Jamal's hands went still around the box. He thought of his neighbors, of Mrs. Alvarez across the way, who often waved, of the kids he'd coached at the community center. He said, without raising his voice, "Officer, I live 3 houses down. I'm on my way home." Hale's jaw worked. He reached for the driver's door of his cruiser, as if to fetch something official, then closed it again. "I don't care where you're from. People like you cause trouble," he snapped. Jamal felt the sting of humiliation bloom hot and unfair, but he kept his posture steady and his voice measured. "If there's a problem, I'd like to know what it is. I haven't done anything wrong." That answer only made Hale colder. He leaned in so close Jamal could see the irritation etched into the faint lines around his eyes. "You're not from around here," Hale said. "You don't belong here. Move along before I make you." The sentence left no doubt about the intent. It was a threat disguised as order, a man asserting power by denying Jamal's right to the very sidewalk where his own house stood. Jamal's mind raced. This was not the first time he'd felt scrutiny walking through neighborhoods where he didn't fit the expected image, but the personal cast of this officer's words landed like a blow. He put the box down gently on the curb to show he meant no trouble, hands open to a future that felt suddenly precarious. "I work nights sometimes, officer." "My hours are not the same as everyone else's," Jamal said. "I'm just heading home. If there's a complaint, I want to resolve it." Hale's gaze flicked to the windows of the houses, and for a second, Jamal thought someone might step outside and challenge the officer, but porch lights simply blinked on and curtains smoothed back into place. The neighborhood quiet was passive, not protective. The cop's voice dropped lower, a warning that carried a promise. You better keep moving. Don't test me. Jamal felt anger burn at the edges, anger at the insult, at the implication that his life and his right to be somewhere depended on someone else's approval. But he swallowed it, knowing how quickly a situation could escalate if he matched the officer's heat. He picked up the box, nodded toward his house, and tried to move past. But Hale stepped to block his path and reached for his wrist as if to guide him where he wanted him to go. The hand on Jamal's arm was firm and had the smell of stale coffee. It made Jamal's skin prickle. You think you can walk through my neighborhood like you own it? Hale whispered. And there it was again, the old familiar logic that equated presence with threat. In that instant, a small detail shifted the balance. A neighbor's porch camera, a white motion-activated light that had blinked on as the cruiser approached, had recorded the encounter from the moment the car rolled up. Unknown to both men, a young mother 2 houses down had been recording her own vlog and turned her camera toward the sound, capturing audio of the exchange, before she realized the seriousness of what was happening. The recording would not be instantaneous evidence that fixed everything, but it captured the tone, the words, the officer's threatened posture in a way that witnesses' memories could not. Hale, sensing his control, pushed harder, insisting Jamal step onto the grass, away from the sidewalk, as if forcing him out of public space. Jamal's patience thinned. He spoke loudly enough that no one on the street could miss it. I pay my taxes. This is my home too. You have no right to threaten me. The officer's face hardened. He reached for his radio and barked in a way that made the instrument tremble, calling in for backup with the clipped language of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A siren wailed faintly in the distance. Hale had called it in. He would justify it. He would claim suspicion. Jamal felt a bewildering mix of fear and resolve. Fear of the uniform and the history it represented, and resolve fueled by the injustice of being told he did not belong in the place he had built a life. He knew then he could not walk away and pretend it had not happened. The officer's threat, thinly veiled though it was, could become something darker if left unchecked. He reached for his phone and, with hands steady despite the shiver in his chest, hit record. He spoke calmly into the device, narrating the interaction, telling the camera his name, the time, and describing what the officer had said. The action was partly for himself, partly a lifeline to the fact that there are ways to hold power accountable if one had the courage and the evidence. When backup arrived, the dynamics shifted. 2 uniformed officers stood on the curb, deferential to Hale's report, waiting to hear his account. Hale's voice was clipped and authoritative as he painted a picture of a man acting suspiciously in a neighborhood. But when Jamal played the video from his phone, the words came through, clear, undeniable, the officer's order to move along, and the sentence, "You don't belong here." All caught on file, all impossible to erase by later spin. A neighbor, in a second-floor window, leaned out and hollered to confirm Jamal's version. Another voice offered to show their doorbell camera footage. The initial advantage Hale thought he had, badge, tone, assumed authority, began to slip. Even so, procedures moved forward. Jamal was asked to show ID, officers took statements, and Hale's report was filed. But the encounter left a bruise deeper than the temporary sting of humiliation. It touched an old wound that many in the community carried, a reminder that uniforms do not always protect. Sometimes they preside over injustice. That night, Jamal sat at his kitchen table and typed a formal complaint to the police department, attaching the video and several neighbors' accounts. He posted a short, carefully worded message to a local community group, not to inflame, but to inform what happened, who was involved, and that he had filed a complaint. Replies flooded in, some messages of support, some questions, and a few fearful notes from people who had their own close calls with the line between law and prejudice. Word spread quietly, but surely. The local journalists, who valued cautious accuracy, asked to speak with Jamal. The facts were precise. It had been a quiet street. A uniformed officer had challenged him, used language that made his belonging conditional, and had threatened consequences for remaining. In the next days, friction and attention would grow, and there would be opportunities for obfuscation and excuses from those invested in protecting one of their own. For now, though, Jamal felt a small but palpable sense of agency. He had documented the moment, he had named it publicly, and he had chosen to reject shame. The course forward would demand patience, legal advice, and a community willing to stand with the truth. Justice would not come from clamor, but from measured persistence, from recorded words and corroborating witnesses, and from a refusal to let a single evening's threat become an accepted fact of life. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty, as if every hour was a test of how long the truth could hold its ground against authority. Jamal went to work, fixed the shelf he had bought nails for, watered his plants, and kept to his ordinary routines. But there was a tension beneath the surface that no quiet act could smooth out. The complaint he had filed was acknowledged with a curt email. "Your report is under review." Those words, meant to be procedural, felt cold, detached, insufficient. Yet behind that formality, something real was happening. Neighbors who had seen the confrontation began to step forward. A retired teacher, Mr. Hanley, who lived 2 houses down, wrote a statement describing how the officer had blocked Jamal's path. A teenager with a phone clip posted her shaky video online, and though the angle was limited, the audio was sharp enough to capture the officer's words about not belonging. Slowly, piece by piece, the fragments aligned into a narrative that was hard to deny. Local media picked it up first, small community outlets that thrived on stories of accountability. A reporter sat with Jamal at his kitchen table, her pen moving briskly as she asked him to relive each moment. Jamal answered calmly, but his hands tightened on the glass of water as he spoke about the officer's grip on his wrist, the humiliating command to move along, the look that had tried to shrink him into silence. The article ran under the headline, "Resident challenges officer's words, you don't belong here." The phrasing was stark, honest, and impossible to ignore. Comments poured into the online version of the story, some supportive, some defensive of law enforcement, but many acknowledging that a line had been crossed. The police department, unused to scrutiny from its own citizens, announced that the incident would undergo an internal investigation. They cited the seriousness of the complaint and the existence of video evidence as reasons. Officer Hale was temporarily reassigned to desk duty. To Jamal, it felt like a small shift, but not yet justice. Reassignment did not erase the harm done, nor did it guarantee a fair outcome. Still, it was a sign that his voice had carried farther than the street corner where it had first been raised. As days stretched into weeks, the community's involvement deepened. Faith leaders wrote letters calling for transparency. Parents at the community center where Jamal volunteered organized a forum where residents spoke not just about his experience, but about the broader pattern it echoed. The meeting hall was filled with quiet intensity as people recounted times when they had been stopped, questioned, or made to feel they were intruding in their own neighborhoods. Jamal sat in the front row, listening, humbled that his willingness to speak had unlocked others' courage. He realized that what had felt like an isolating humiliation was, in fact, part of a collective wound and part of a collective strength. The department eventually convened a formal hearing, with Jamal invited to testify. The room was fluorescent lit, lined with rows of chairs, with an air of cold bureaucracy that seemed designed to sap emotion. But Jamal carried with him the weight of every neighbor's nod, every message of encouragement, every signature on a petition demanding accountability. When he recounted the officer's words, "You don't belong here," his voice did not tremble. When he explained that his home was 3 doors down, that he had been carrying nails for a simple household repair, his words painted a contrast so sharp it left no room for excuse. He showed his phone recording, he submitted the neighbor's videos, he let the evidence speak where his emotions might have faltered. Officer Hale gave his account too, insisting that he had been acting on suspicion, that he had believed Jamal matched a vague description from an earlier call. But the footage betrayed the absence of neutrality in his tone, the personal edge of his words, the unmistakable hostility that could not be explained away by protocol. The panel took notes, asked questions, pressed him on inconsistencies. For the first time since that evening, Jamal saw the officer falter, his confidence cracking under the weight of his own recorded voice. When the verdict was announced weeks later, it was measured yet decisive. The department acknowledged misconduct, citing the officer's words as inappropriate and discriminatory in effect. Hale was suspended without pay, ordered into mandatory retraining, and stripped of his patrol duties. For some, the punishment seemed too light. For others, it was more accountability than they had ever seen from within the system. To Jamal, it was not about the severity of the officer's fall, but about the principle that the truth had been recognized. The words, "You don't belong here," had been met with an official rebuke. He did belong, and it was the officer's actions that had been out of line. Justice, Jamal realized, was not a single gavel strike or a headline. It was a process, messy and imperfect, but possible when courage and evidence met persistence. The neighbors who had once drawn their curtains now waved more openly, greeting him with warmth that carried a silent apology and a louder solidarity. Children on bikes rode past his house with a sense of safety that he hoped would outlast memory of that evening. The porch lights still flickered on at dusk, but now, when Jamal stepped outside, he felt them less as watchful eyes and more as beacons of community. One night, months later, he stood on his porch, the repaired shelf holding steady inside his living room, the nails he had carried that evening still gleaming faintly in his memory. He thought about how close silence had come to swallowing the truth, how easily fear could have made him let the moments slip away. Instead, he had spoken, he had recorded, he had endured. And because of that, the story had shifted, not just his own, but the neighborhoods, maybe even the cities. The words, "You don't belong here," had been overturned by the most powerful proof of all. Belonging was not granted by authority, but by presence, by roots, by the undeniable truth of home.